Welcome back for the third day of the sew along. Today is just for the strap views, so that is views A and C. If you are sewing up views B or D, or the views with the sleeve, you can go ahead and skip today and come back tomorrow. Go ahead and grab your strap pattern pieces and you're going to fold it in half, right sides together lengthwise, and then we'll go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch that at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance, which will actually create a 1/2 inch strap. And just like you did for the button loops, you are going to trim down those seam allowances to about a 1/16 of an inch, and then you're going to need to turn them right side out. So I'm going to use my loop turner tool. You could also really easily use just a safety pin to turn these because they're a little bit wider than your button loops. And once you have those straps right side out, you are going to go ahead and press those flat. Go ahead and grab your main dress and you're going to lay it out flat with the right side up. And we are going to pin each of the raw ends of the straps at the upper edges of the front and back bodice. Make sure that the right sides are touching. Now I am obviously using my trusted glue stick here, but you can also just pin it and then baste it in place. Before basting or gluing, just make sure that your straps are not twisted when you do this. Okay, next you're going to go ahead and grab your lining facing and you're going to put it on top of your main dress with the right sides touching. You are going to pin matching all of the notches, the dots, and the seams. Just keep in mind when you're doing this that the upper angled neckline of the main bodice is slightly longer than the bodice lining. So you're going to need to ease this area when you are pinning and stitching. And then we're going to go ahead and stitch at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance along all of those edges. Make sure that you are leaving your needle down and pivoting at each corner. So that includes the dots and around the straps. One thing I also like to do is I like to baste in the areas of the straps, especially the front straps, and then that way I can adjust the length of them after I try it on. This is not only attaching the lining and facing to the main dress, but also keep in mind that the button loops and the button shield are sandwiched in the middle, so it's also securing those in place. So be extra careful, especially along that center front edge where the button loops are. Make sure that you're keeping that at a really consistent 1/2 inch seam allowance. Otherwise, your button loops will end up at different lengths because your seam allowance is changing when you're attaching them. One last thing I want you to just be extra aware of is just make sure that you are not catching any of that middle section of your straps in the seam as you're sewing. I like to just stop here for a second and check my button loops at this point. So I take one of my loose buttons and I just make sure that it fits within my button loop. And then if there's any that ended up a little bit smaller or bigger for some reason, you can always adjust them at this point. Next, we're going to trim corners, notch all of the curved areas, and grade any seam allowances where necessary. How bulky your fabric is going to determine how much you want to grade. The seam allowances along the center front help to stabilize the button loops and the buttons in later steps. So I am very careful in this area. I usually don't do a lot of grading if my fabric is on the thinner side like this fabric is, or the rayon crepe that I'm doing for my other view. So this is kind of up to you, and you're going to have to decide how much bulk you want to take out of these areas. Also, if like me you decided to baste your straps in place because you might adjust them later, do not trim around those areas because you might want that extra length, and then you can trim those later after you have decided how long you want your straps to be. Okay, we're going to turn our dress right side out now. So we are flipping the lining and facing to the inside, gently pulling on the straps to get a nice point at those corners. before we go ahead and press everything, we are going to go ahead and do some understitching first. Understitching is a great way to help the lining and facing stay tucked to the inside of the dress. So how we're going to do this is we are going to press the lining and the facings away from the main dress and over the seam allowances. And then we're going to understitch, which is right next to that seam between the lining, facing, and main dress. So I like to start at the bottom edge of the front facing. I understitched within about 1 inch of the front neckline dot. You can't stitch all the way up into that area because it's too tight. So, and then you're going to do the same thing for the front necklines, the underarms, and the back neckline. Continue down the other side of the front facing in the same way. Make sure when you're doing this that all the button loops and the button shields stay pressed towards the main dress during the process. Their seam allowances will be pressed towards the facing and will get caught in that understitching. Once again, just to reiterate, you'll see while I'm stitching here that you cannot stitch up into the straps. You can't stitch all the way into each of the corners. So I stop about 1 inch before each strap and then start about 1 inch after, and then just continue stitching. So you're just kind of doing the understitching where it's possible. Now that all of that understitching is done, it's a really good time to give your dress a really good press. So if your lining and facing, like mine, are a different color than your main fabric, you need to be extra careful that you're kind of cheating that lining and facing to the inside so that it's not visible from the outside of your dress when you're wearing it. And once you have that all pressed, this is when you want to go ahead and try on your Lora dress and make any adjustments that you need to the straps, to the side seams. This will be really hard once we go ahead and sew down the bodice lining to the bodice. So you want to do that at this point. Okay, once you have made all the adjustments that you want to, it is time to attach the lining to the main dress at the bottom of the bodice edge. So I'm using my glue stick once again, but you can of course pin this. The important thing is that you are extra precise and extra careful. If you need to use your iron a little bit to get out any wrinkles, you can, but you want to make sure not only that like all the side seams match up really well, but that that bottom folded edge lines up really precisely with that seam that attaches the main bodice to the main skirt. Now there's a couple ways that you can finish this. So for a more high-end finish, you can actually hand stitch the lining to the main dress down along that folded edge. This is what I'm going to use when I do the sleeved view tomorrow, but this is a cotton fabric. It's a little bit more casual. Also, this fabric is really busy, so you will not notice a stitch line as much. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a line of edge stitching on the right side of the fabric, a 1/16 of an inch inside of the bodice or inside of that seam for where the skirt meets the bodice. So when you're doing this, because you're really precise in how you pinned or glued the lining in place, you should be catching just the very edge of the lining in that stitch line underneath as you are sewing. So it should look something like this when you are finished. Don't worry if it's not absolutely perfect, especially on the inside of the dress. Nobody is going to notice. And that is where we're going to finish today. So tomorrow we are going to be doing a lot of these same steps as well as the sleeves on the sleeved views of the bodice. If you are sewing up a spaghetti strap view, you can skip tomorrow and come back on the 5th day of the sew along to finish up your Lora dress.